I was elbow-deep in an old tractor engine when I heard tires crunching up the gravel. I didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. Only one person in the entire HOA drove a bright yellow crossover with vanity plates that read Queenby. "Zayden Fletcher," came the shrill voice I'd come to expect every time I dared to breathe on my own property. "We need to talk, now." I wiped my hands on a rag and turned slowly. There she was, Kendra Whitlow, 50-something, always in a pastel cardigan, clipboard clutched like a weapon, and that permanent expression like she just smelled expired milk. Kendra was the president of our HOA, Maple Ridge Estates, which had slowly started extending its claws into the surrounding properties, including mine. The problem? My ranch wasn't part of Maple Ridge, never had been. "You're trespassing," I said flatly, nodding at the private property sign directly behind her. She huffed and stepped closer anyway. "Zayden, this is about community standards. Your livestock is visible from the new development road. We have aesthetic guidelines to uphold." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm not in your development, you know that." "That's where you're wrong," she said, eyes gleaming. "The board voted to include your ranch in our jurisdiction last month. It's official now, which means I have a right to inspect the grounds." I actually laughed. "You voted to annex my land." "That's not how property law works." Kendra's nose twitched. "You're being combative. If you have nothing to hide, you'll let me take a look around. Otherwise, we'll handle this legally." She turned and marched toward my barn like she owned the place. I walked after her, blocking her path. "You step 1 foot past this point, and I'll consider it criminal trespass." Her eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't dare." "I know the law better than you think." She left in a huff, but not before shouting, "You'll be hearing from our lawyer." I watched her drive off, tires spinning a little too aggressively for someone complaining about aesthetic standards. I went back to my barn, shaking my head. I'd retired from law for a reason: peace, quiet, and a little land to work with. But HOA Karen had just kicked the hornet's nest. A week later, I received a letter from the HOA attorney, a guy who claimed to be one. It was printed on cheap paper, full of vague threats, and ended with, "Failure to comply will result in further legal action." I chuckled and set it on my desk. They had no legal standing. My ranch sat just outside the Maple Ridge boundary. I'd purchased it 8 years ago, long before the HOA existed. But what really got me was the next move. 2 days after the letter, I came home from the feed store to find a process server on my porch. "You Zayden Fletcher?" "Yeah, you've been served." I opened the packet. Kendra Whitlow and the Maple Ridge HOA were suing me for obstructing community access, violating aesthetic ordinances, and refusing inspection. I stared at the paperwork. She really went there. That's when the old instincts kicked in. I wasn't just some rancher. I was a retired attorney. And if Kendra thought she could bully me with fake legal jargon and a power trip, she was about to learn the hard way what happens when you sue the wrong guy. The courthouse lobby smelled like old paper and sweat. I stood in front of the filing clerk's window with Kendra's lawsuit in one hand and my own counterclaim in the other. The kid behind the glass barely looked old enough to rent a car, but he took the documents with a nod and disappeared into the back. As I waited, I glanced around at the polished tile, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the security guard slouched by the metal detector. I hadn't set foot in this building since my retirement 5 years ago, and now here I was again, not as counsel, but as a defendant in a suit so flimsy I could have shredded it with a sneeze. The clerk returned, gave me my stamped copies, and I left without a word. By the time I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, there were 3 HOA board members waiting near my gate. None of them crossed the line onto my property, but they stood close enough that I could read the smug little name tags clipped to their jackets. One of them, a guy with suspenders and a Bluetooth headset, stepped forward. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, like we were negotiating lawn furniture prices. "You're trespassing," I said, not slowing my pace as I walked toward the house. "And I've already filed my counterclaim. You'll be served within the week." "Zayden, come on," called the woman next to him, her voice syrupy. "This isn't personal. We just need to make sure the neighborhood stays consistent." Kendra says I stopped on the porch and turned around. You're quoting Kendra like she's a city official. But here's the thing. She's not. She's a volunteer with a clipboard and a god complex. "And if any of you step onto my land again, I'll have you arrested." They muttered something I didn't bother catching and left, visibly less confident than when they arrived. I spent the next few days compiling everything I'd need. Satellite imagery showing the property boundary, the original deed with parcel numbers, county zoning maps, and a notarized statement from the previous owner confirming the land had never been part of any HOA. I also contacted a buddy of mine who still practiced real estate law in the city. He agreed to co-counsel, mostly for fun, said it reminded him of the old days before we both got sick of billable hours and backroom politics. The court scheduled a hearing for preliminary motions. The moment we walked into the room, Kendra spun around in her seat like she was starring in a courtroom drama. Her attorney, if you could call him that, was a thin man with an ill-fitting suit who shuffled papers like they were foreign objects. "You finally decided to play ball," she said, lips twitching. "No," I said, sliding into the chair at the defense table. "I came to end the game." The judge entered, and the hearing began. Kendra's lawyer stumbled through a weak opening, citing vague HOA bylaws and referencing irrelevant cases. When it was our turn, I stood and walked the court through the parcel map, zoning laws, and the county's own records showing no legal mechanism for the HOA to annex properties. I finished by placing a laminated deed onto the evidence table. The judge squinted at the documents and said, "Mr. Fletcher, do you have any legal training?" "Retired civil attorney," I said. "I see. That explains the formatting." She turned to Kendra's lawyer. "Counselor, do you have any evidence to refute this?" He glanced around like he might find an answer on the wall. "We were told by the board president that—" "Let me stop you there," the judge said. "Belief is not evidence. I'm dismissing the HOA's suit with prejudice." Kendra shot up like her seat had shocked her. "You can't do that. I'm the president." The judge didn't even look up. "And I'm the judge. Sit down or leave." She stormed out, heels clicking like gunshots, but I wasn't done. The counterclaim included trespassing, harassment, and attempted interference with property rights. The judge scheduled that for a full hearing in 6 weeks, which gave me time to dig deeper. And dig I did. I pulled property records, financial disclosures, and minutes from HOA meetings. Most of it was dull, poorly documented budgets, nepotistic contracts, but one thing jumped out. Kendra had authorized payments to a landscaping company owned by her nephew, despite the board never approving the expense. Over $50,000 had gone to this so-called company, which had no website, no business license, and no employees other than the nephew himself. I took the information to the county DA's office. The investigator there, a no-nonsense woman named Ramirez, didn't take long to see the pattern. "This falls under municipal fraud," she said. "We'll open an inquiry." 3 weeks later, uniformed officers arrived at Kendra's home and walked her out in cuffs. I watched from my porch as she screamed about conspiracies and slander, but the sheriff just closed the cruiser door and drove off without a word. The news spread fast. Residents who'd been too nervous to speak up before suddenly found their voices. People started coming to me with stories. Unexplained fines, threats of foreclosure over minor infractions, ignored maintenance requests, and even forged signatures on proxy votes. I helped them draft a petition for a special election to dissolve the current HOA board. They needed 60% of homeowners to sign. They got 78. The election was held in the gym of the local elementary school. I didn't run for anything. Didn't have to. A former postal worker named Darlene, a retired firefighter, and a single mom who ran a small bakery made up the new board. Not one of them owned a pastel cardigan. After the dust settled, I got a visit from the new president. She brought a pie as a thank you. "You didn't have to do all that," she said, setting the box on my porch table. Sure I did, I said, opening the lid. Apple cinnamon. Bullies don't stop unless someone makes them. She nodded, then pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket. By the way, the board voted to formally acknowledge your ranch as outside the HOA, completely and permanently. Appreciated, I said, taking a bite. She hesitated before leaving. One more thing. Kendra filed a complaint from jail. Said you used your legal privilege to embarrass her. She embarrassed herself, I said, brushing crumbs from my hands. As she drove off, I leaned back in my chair and looked out over the pasture. The horses were calm. The air smelled like pine. And for the first time in a long while, the only thing buzzing was the wind through the trees, not a woman with a clipboard and too much time on her hands. 3 weeks after Kendra was arrested and the HOA board was overturned, I got a call from investigator Ramirez. Her tone had shifted sharper, more deliberate. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, "you mentioned you'd pulled some meeting minutes. Did any of those include budget proposals or votes on community infrastructure?" "Plenty," I said. "Why?" "I need you to bring every document you have. There's something deeper going on." I drove down to her office with a banker's box full of records. Ramirez met me at the front, waved me past the reception desk, and led me to a small room with bare walls and a humming ceiling vent. She shut the door behind us and pointed to the table. "Lay it all out." As I spread the paperwork, she pulled out a laptop and opened a folder full of scanned bank statements. I recognized the Maple Ridge HOA account number immediately. She clicked through a series of deposits and withdrawals, then paused at a line item. "Look at this," she said, tapping the screen. "That's a $5,000 payment supposedly for sidewalk repair, but the check was cashed by a company that doesn't exist in the state registry." I flipped through my papers. "Here," I said, sliding over a typed page. Meeting minutes from 2 months ago. The board approved a sidewalk repair budget, but there's no mention of which contractor got the job, just a vague local vendor reference. Ramirez leaned back. "We've cross-checked that vendor name with every licensed contractor in the county. Nothing matches. And this isn't the only one. There are at least 9 similar payments totaling over $90,000. "Embezzlement," I said. "Systematic," she replied. "Cleaned and filtered through fake LLCs. We're building a case, but we need a witness who can explain how the board operated, someone who wasn't involved but understands the legal framework." I didn't have to think about it. "I'll do it," she nodded once. "We're going to need testimony, possibly grand jury." "You sure you're ready to jump back into this?" "I never left," I said. "I just stopped charging hourly." Within days, subpoenas were flying. Several former board members lawyered up. Kendra, still in custody on fraud charges tied to the landscaping scam, had no idea the rabbit hole had only just opened. But the real break came when a former HOA treasurer named Owen Raskin contacted Ramirez voluntarily. He was soft-spoken, kept his eyes down, and had the hunched shoulders of someone who'd been carrying regret too long. "I didn't know how deep it went," he said in a recorded interview. "I thought it was just shady contracts." But when I tried to raise concerns, Kendra threatened to report me for falsifying records, said she'd bury me in legal fees if I didn't keep quiet. Ramirez asked him to elaborate. "She forged votes," he said. "Backdated proxies, held unannounced meetings. And the budget numbers, those were changed after meetings ended. She'd call me on the side and say, 'Adjust it, or I'll find someone who will.' I saved the emails." Emails. That was the missing link. With Owen's account, the DA's office obtained a warrant to search Kendra's email server, the same one she'd used to communicate with board members. It was technically a private server, hosted through a third-party provider, but her HOA title gave the investigators enough of a hook. What they found shattered whatever defense she had left. Emails detailing kickbacks, threats to silence dissenting homeowners, and one particularly damning message sent to a man named Curtis Bell, a developer with a reputation for strong-arming small HOAs into selling common areas for pennies on the dollar. The subject line: Maple Ridge Phase 2 Timeline and Incentive Breakdown. Kendra had been negotiating to sell the community's greenbelt and playground to Bell's company in exchange for a personal payout routed through her nephew's landscaping firm. The deal would have stripped the neighborhood of its only public space, and no vote had ever been held. I sat with Ramirez as she reviewed the evidence. She was trying to liquidate community assets for personal gain, I said. Ramirez rubbed her temple. She didn't just break rules. She buried them. When the charges were updated, they included wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to defraud over 100 homeowners. The penalties? Decades. Meanwhile, the new HOA board had been working to rebuild community trust. The retired firefighter, Paul, had turned out to be a meticulous records keeper. He'd already instituted open meetings, posted financials online, and launched an anonymous reporting system for member concerns. One evening, Paul stopped by with a folder in hand. He looked tired but determined. "Got something you might want to see," he said, sliding the folder onto my kitchen table. I opened it. Inside were copies of internal memos from the old board memos that hadn't been handed over to the DA. They were drafts, unsigned and written in Kendra's handwriting. One memo laid out a plan to rezone surrounding land for community expansion, including the construction of a gated entrance funded by mandatory assessments. Another memo included a list of properties marked for reclassification, including mine, with notes beside each. Non-compliant, potential legal challenge, force compliance via municipal tie-in. They were planning to rope in properties through backdoor zoning pressure, I said. Paul nodded. We think they were trying to get the county to designate this whole area as part of a special improvement district. Once that happened, they could have forced you and others to join the HOA under the guise of infrastructure cost sharing. They'd need to bribe someone in county zoning for that. Paul's expression told me he'd already thought the same. The next morning, I contacted an old friend of mine, Marion Sutter, a zoning attorney who'd once sued the city for improperly approving a development permit near a protected watershed. She agreed to meet Ramirez and me at the county office to review the zoning applications submitted under Kendra's tenure. Sure enough, there it was. An application to reclassify the Maple Ridge boundary lines, dated 6 months ago, bearing the signature of a now retired zoning official, someone who'd left the county under suspicious circumstances. Marion pointed to the digital signature. That's a ghost sign. This person didn't authorize it. Someone used their credentials after they left. Forgery, digital tampering, municipal fraud. Ramirez leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle. This just became a federal case. The FBI got involved 2 days later. I kept my distance after that, letting the professionals do their work. But word traveled fast in Maple Ridge. Former residents who had moved away due to harassment started returning to testify. One woman brought a binder full of letters Kendra had sent, threatening liens over non-existent violations. Another brought photos of her cracked sidewalk, the one supposedly repaired by the fake contractor. At the federal hearing, I sat in the back of the courtroom, arms crossed, watching as Kendra was led in wearing a beige jumpsuit and plastic slippers. She scanned the room, eyes wild, and landed on me. "Traitor," she shouted. "This was my neighborhood." The judge didn't flinch. "Remove the defendant." They dragged her out, still screaming. Back at the ranch, things had quieted down. The air seemed lighter. Neighbors I'd never spoken to before started waving as they passed my gate. Someone even left a basket of tomatoes on my fence post with a note. "Thanks for saving our hides." I didn't need thanks, just peace. Still, I couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction when I opened the paper a week later and saw the headline: "Former HOA president indicted on federal charges in multi-level fraud scheme." Beneath it was a photo of Kendra being escorted by U.S. Marshals, her face twisted in disbelief. I folded the paper and tossed it onto the table. Then I stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and looked out over the pasture. The ranch dogs were chasing each other near the creek, the windmill creaked like always, and the sun was just starting to warm the eastern ridge. The HOA was quiet. And for the first time in a long while, so was I. The last burst of fall wind carried the scent of wood smoke and pine across the ridge as I drove into town. Ramirez had asked me to meet her at the county records office. She'd said nothing on the phone, just that she'd found something I should see in person. Coming from her, that meant it was going to be significant, maybe even the last piece of the puzzle. The records office was a squat red brick building tucked between the assessor's office and the DMV. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of file cabinets and laminate desks. Ramirez was standing near the back, flipping through a manila folder while a clerk hovered nearby. She waved me over without looking up. "I requested the land use petitions filed during Kendra's final year on the board," she said. "Take a look at this one." She handed me a form titled Petition for Subdivision Redevelopment, dated 9 months ago. I scanned it. The listed parcel was familiar. It bordered the retention pond behind Maple Ridge and technically belonged to the city, designated as a protected watershed easement. The petition proposed rerouting the water flow and paving over the easement to make room for an amenities center, a phrase used to describe anything from a pool to a clubhouse. She tried to develop the watershed, I asked. Ramirez nodded. Illegally. She filed this under a dummy LLC using a forged signature from a former city engineer. If that had gone through, the entire downstream water system would have been destabilized. That pond feeds into the irrigation canals east of here. I set the file down, my stomach tightening. So she wasn't just stealing money, she was tampering with public infrastructure. Exactly, Ramirez said. And there's more. The LLC that filed the petition, it's registered to an address in Nevada. We traced it back to a shell corporation linked to Curtis Bell, the same developer she was negotiating with. That changed everything. What had started as local-level corruption had just crossed state lines and involved environmental fraud. And now that federal agencies were already involved, this gave them jurisdiction to push even further. Ramirez took a breath. The U.S. attorney has greenlit a joint task force. Environmental Protection, IRS, and the Bureau of Land Management are all on board now. We're officially looking at a conspiracy to commit environmental sabotage for financial gain. I leaned against the desk. She almost got away with it. She would have, Ramirez said, if you hadn't stopped her at that gate. By the following week, subpoenas were issued for both Curtis Bell and his regional director. Bell didn't respond and vanished from his corporate offices. But the regional director, a man named Jeffrey Langdon, caved after 3 hours in federal custody. His statement confirmed what we'd suspected. Kendra had been feeding him insider information about HOA-held land, promising to push through rezoning in exchange for a share of the profits. Langdon also admitted that Bell's company had a standing arrangement with several small HOAs throughout the state targeting communities with aging infrastructure and vulnerable leadership. Kendra had been one of several facilitators, but the only one who'd taken it as far as forging public documents and tampering with protected land. The DA's office moved fast. They sealed a grand jury indictment and prepped for a multi-agency trial. With Kendra already in custody, they transferred her to a federal holding facility. Her lawyer filed a motion for bail, citing emotional distress, but the judge denied it within minutes. At the pre-trial hearing, I took the stand as a key witness. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every rustling paper sound like thunder. I stuck to the facts, the boundary maps, the trespass, the fake annexation vote, the forged zoning application. I made sure every word was clear and every piece of evidence irrefutable. Kendra sat at the defense table, her suit rumpled, her hair unkempt. She no longer looked like a neighborhood tyrant, just a desperate woman cornered by the truth. The prosecution's case was airtight. Between the emails, financial records, and Langdon's testimony, the jury didn't need long. They returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge didn't hold back. She cited the abuse of public trust, the endangerment of protected land, and the calculated nature of the fraud. "For your actions," the judge said, "you are hereby sentenced to 18 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 12. Kendra didn't argue. She just stared ahead, eyes vacant, as the bailiffs led her out. After the verdict, I found myself back at the ranch with more visitors than usual. Neighbors came by in small clusters, some with pies or jars of preserves, others just to shake my hand. One man, a truck mechanic who lived on the far side of the neighborhood, brought over a folded letter. "I found this in my mailbox last year," he said. "Didn't think much of it at the time." It was a fake warning, typed on HOA letterhead, accusing him of violating a noise ordinance. He'd never had a complaint before or after. We added it to the growing collection of resident testimonies. The new board, led by Paul and Darlene, had opened a community archive, an online repository of every document, complaint, and vote. They also passed a new charter amendment requiring full transparency for all board actions, with monthly audits conducted by third-party volunteers. No more secret meetings, no more forged minutes, and definitely no more Kendra. A month later, I got a letter from the State Bar Association. Someone had nominated me for a civic service award. I declined. I didn't need recognition, but I did attend the next HOA meeting. It was held in the elementary school gym again, only this time the folding chairs were filled with smiling faces. Kids ran back and forth near the snack table, and someone had brought a projector to go over budget projections. No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. Paul waved me toward the front. "We just finished the vote on the Greenbelt restoration," he said. "Unanimous yes. We're planting native trees and restoring the pond runoff. Thought you'd want to know." I nodded. "Good. That land deserves better than what almost happened to it." As I turned to leave, someone called out from the back, "Zayden, are you ever going to run for the board?" I shook my head with a grin. "I already did my time. Besides, you've got it covered." Back at the ranch, the sun dipped low over the hills, casting long shadows across the pasture. The horses flicked their tails lazily, and the dogs dozed under the porch bench. I sat in my old rocking chair, the courthouse transcripts tucked under one arm, and listened to the wind rustle the pine needles. The war was over. The tyrant deposed. The neighborhood reclaimed. And as the sky faded from gold to deep blue, I took a breath, not out of relief, but because, for the first time in years, I finally could.